video that tries to capture one of these examples, right? And I'll sort of hone in on this one to start with. What it is it is the world's first displacement risk financing mechanism, right? And it was piloted in Uganda, and now we're setting one up also in Ethiopia. And so what we do is we measure public service pressure, right, in the districts in these countries that host refugees, right? And then we identify the number of people in the host community that actually live in these districts and the number of refugees already resettled in these districts. And then we capture change in the number of refugees increasingly settled in these districts over time, right? So it's a population-based measure. And what that means is that we're then able to basically measure number of people per functioning water point, number of people per health center, and number of people and number of school-aged children per classroom, right? These are not perfect measures of access to public services, but we also have to be realistic about what data we can get that measures what consistently across different administrative territories in these countries. So if I can go to the next slide where we have a video, then what we'll do is we'll show you this video about that. Do we have the video, guys, to play? Yeah, there should be a video right here, which basically introduces you to the displacement crisis response mechanism and how it functions specifically in Uganda. Now, it'll also give you some insight into the actual performance of a model that predicts refugee flows into Uganda, right? And so while we're getting this video set up, I'll go to the why. So can I scroll through? Yes. So in Uganda, they had the first development response to displacement impacts project, right? It was around $230 million targeted at public services, poverty, and environmental degradation associated, in effect, with demographic expansion, right? Increasing the population in these different districts. So the project was also was implemented across Djibouti, Ethiopia, Kenya, as well as Uganda. But Uganda hosts the largest refugee population in Africa, and it increased from just 220,000 in 2016 to now it's over 1 million today. That 1.8 million number is I think a 2024 number. And so this, of course, places this burden on refugees and also drives tension between host and refugee communities, right? But the problem with, say, World Bank, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, development operations, is they decide what activities to finance, at what scale, in what locations, including with whom, at the start of a project, right? And when these projects run for 4 or 5 years, that can be highly problematic because, as you see, you make the determination about what to do where, when, here, and then the level of need changes dramatically. And what that means is that at this point in time, when you have an enormous influx of refugees, that influx could come from South Sudan or from DRC, and at totally different levels. There may be a decline in the level of conflict in DRC and a significant increase in South Sudan, meaning that the pressure could be really concentrated on these host districts in the north as opposed to in the south west. And so how do we respond within a project, you know, with complex procurement and financing arrangements with government where where we know that there are certain districts that already have enormous levels of pressure, but that pressure is going to be changing, right? And so what we did is we collected data, and it represents change in the number of people per you have the video now? Okay, so let's play the video, which summarizes it much better than I ever will. And then I can try and fill in some of the blanks for you.
Every year, millions flee their homes due to conflict, climate change, or other crises. When refugees arrive in large numbers, host communities struggle as basic public services, health, education, and water are overstretched.
Volume that you have.
Resources often arrive too late or not where they are needed most.
We all have an imagination, but I don't know if we can guess exactly what
AI can predict refugee movements.
Ziad, you had that, at least some sound coming before, right? Yeah.
Due to conflict, climate change, or other crises. When refugees arrive in large numbers, host communities struggle as basic public services, health, education, and water are overstretched. Resources often arrive too late or not where they are needed most. But what if we told you AI can predict refugee movements before they happen and help us prepare better responses? The World Bank has developed an AI-powered model to support the Displacement Crisis Response Mechanism, or DCRM, the world's first displacement risk financing mechanism. The AI model uses machine learning to predict refugee arrivals 4 to 6 months in advance. It analyzes over 90 variables like conflict, economic shifts, climate data, and even news and social media language to anticipate movement. This prediction data enables governments to build water points, expand health facilities, and construct classrooms before refugees arrive. The model has been tested in Uganda on UNHCR's daily refugee arrivals data from 2014 to 2023. Data scientists collected the data for refugees coming from South Sudan and the DRC, producing a model with high predictive accuracy. When refugee inflows increased pressure on Ugandan services, the DCRM was triggered and funds were disbursed to build up water points, health facilities, and schools. Better access to public services reduces tensions between refugee and host communities and strengthens resilience. The AI model also identifies which factors drive change in refugee flows. This evidence helps the World Bank better target operations and prevent displacement. In the future, the model could also be adapted to predict and explain other important development issues, such as poverty levels or macro fiscal pressures. Learn how AI is helping predict refugee movements to improve our response. Stay tuned for updates.
In effect, what we've done there in Uganda is we've tested this model, right? And we've developed it. But if we come back to this question of why predict change in population, right? You have to have a population-oriented measure, you know, that can then actually inform disbursement of finance, right? Proportionate to need. And for development organizations like the World Bank, that's quite a significant step forward to be able to iterate within what you might call the project life cycle, right? And so if we're able to do that, right, then what does that basically mean for what's dispersed to do what, where, right? So in the first iteration of the displacement crisis response mechanism, we piloted this, right, across Uganda. And what that meant was that we were able to basically make disbursements of just a small pilot of $5 million. And we made 2 of these disbursements. And by measuring this capability, this public service specific pressure, we're able to actually see and rank the different districts that host refugees in Uganda, specific to each public service sector, right? And what that means is that we're able to rank and say, okay, if we decide to spend $3 million, right, we can make a determination overall in the country. This is the sector that's under most pressure, water. This is the other sector, health. Here we also have education, right? And so we can say, okay, if we're going to say spend 60% of that money on water, then we can say which of those districts actually have the greatest level of pressure and the greatest level of need. And then we can quantify how many new water points do we need to construct in those districts to bring the number of people, say 3,000 people per functioning water point, down below and agree at a threshold that we agree with the Ugandan government, right? Of say 2,800, 2,500, right? And if we have specified standardized costings for building new schools with a certain number of classrooms, then to bring the number of school-aged children per classroom from 140 down below a threshold of 120, we not only know how many classrooms we need to construct in that district, but also what the standardized cost is. And what that also means is that we can pre-procure, right? We can pre-procure, we can pre-identify and have what we call on-the-shelf sub-projects ready to go. Now, what this means is that at that point in time, we're able to take to be able to have construction commence much faster, right? So instead of the refugees resettled in a district, and then that changes the number of people, that changes that per person measure, and then we make a determination looking at the data, yes, that's changed the measure, and therefore now what we're able to do is we're able to start a procurement process, right? And then a water contract, and then have the construction begin, right? Now, there's a lag in that time. And the most sensitive point in time, right, is when the refugees actually arrive, right? So in the pilot phase, we just measured, observed, then procured, then constructed, right? So it's obviously much better than deciding at the start of a 5-year project and implementing irrespective of how need changes. But what it meant is that we're able to quantify and then decide how many new water points are necessary to bring down the public service pressure in each of these districts. Now, for our colleagues in government, it also is legitimating, right? Because political leaders from different districts come along and say, oh, everyone's so needy in my district, and of course they are, right? But it provides them the data to be able to go back to those political leaders and to communities and explain why we're prioritizing health in your district, but not water and education, right? By showing this comparative level of need. Now, with predictive capacity, we can take a further step forward. And instead of acting like this in the status quo of the displacement crisis response mechanism, we can actually act like this, right? And we can begin to procure and to construct in advance of refugees arriving. So how do we develop this capacity to predict human behavior? We all interact with humans. We know we're not the most rational species around, right? And our problem is we behave not like weather, right? It's not like predicting flood. It's not like predicting the weather each week. We behave according to what we perceive, you know, not just according to symmetrically according to actual change in reality. So here, think about this gentleman looking down the road. He's seeing the weather changing. He's seeing changing price of gas. He's seeing foodstuffs there. He's seeing change in the built environment around him, right? But he's also exposed to an information ecosystem that shapes his views of these things. He also talks to people directly. So what can we capture of these things? How do we capture change in the built environment, the social world, and the natural world, as well as change the dynamic relationship of change in reality to change in perceptions of it, you know, while people are continuously exposed to dynamic information ecosystems, right? What we need to do is engage with expertise, right? I'm from New Zealand. I mean, if it were up to me to decide which factors we're going to prioritize to try to predict refugee inflows from DRC, we would have a big problem, right? So we need multidisciplinary expertise, right? Specific to the thing we're trying to predict, human displacement, in the place we're trying to predict it, DRC or South Sudan, so that they can help us identify which factors, if we're going to use this data or that data, does that data appropriately measure those phenomena, right? Real or perceived, right? How do we weigh trade-offs in including or excluding different phenomena? And then we want to vet it with people with a range of lived experiences from these places, right? At each step of the model development process, if you don't have, a constructive but nonetheless sort of contested evaluation of the logics that inform which phenomena, what data best measures them, how you curate that data, what trade-offs you weigh, you've already lost the game before you even start designing the experiments, right? And so what we do is we develop these models. Can we go to the next slide? It doesn't seem to be. Here we go. It doesn't want to go to the next one, but what that means is that, right, here we go. We need to identify data representing all these different dimensions of reality, right? Local food prices, fuel prices, volume and value of minerals exports from that territory, measures of macro-physical pressure like foreign reserves on hand, change in the currency, change in crop type, crop yield, crop failure from satellite imagery down to about 5 square meters resolution, change in standing pools of water, of course, temperature, everything that would go into a natural disaster risk financing product, but also change in the subjective perception of these things, right? And our challenge is always, we need frequent change in that data and historical depth, right? So household surveys aren't going to be of use, right? We need to be able to collect data that measures these things frequently. And then we have to develop a model, see how well it goes. If it's not going well, try again, right? So with our colleagues from UNHCR, we have the number of daily registered refugee arrivals entering Uganda from both South Sudan and DRC. So what we do is we train the model on this data from 2014 through 2020, and of course with data representing all the dimensions of reality and perception of it, between 2014 and 2020. And then over sort of late 2020, 2021, we test and see how well did the model do, right? Well, not well, okay, let's try again. And we iterate that process over a number of months, right? Trying different weightings for different phenomena, different types of models, and then we give it one shot, right? In 2022 and 2023. And we, because when you're running a predictive model, right, you don't get the opportunity, to try again and try again, right? If you're predicting something, you predict it and you get it right or you get it wrong. And so that's what this measures. That's why this just shows you 2022 and 2023, right? Is our model predicting in blue the number of refugees entering Uganda over the next 120 days at any point in time, and then in green you can see the actual number of refugees that entered over that same point in time, right? And so we got it to so it did perform at a level of predictive performance where the counterpart, the government of Uganda, says we want to continue with this and maybe connect it to this displacement crisis response mechanism so we can trigger disbursements in advance. So now we're at the point where we're starting to run it live and see how it performs live. But you can also see, say for South Sudan, that we identify, as it said in the video, which factors are most associated with change, right? So everything from local food prices, language about food prices, language about public services, not just in South Sudan, but also in Uganda where people are going, right? Volume of like Google searches about migration to Uganda, what hour of the day people are posting things on social media or online news articles are occurring. And what it means is that, yes, we can, instead of acting with status quo, act in advance. And what that means is that we're not able to just act in advance, right? For our colleagues in DRC and in South Sudan, they're also empowered with the dynamic dimensions of reality and perception of it that are most associated with displacement into Uganda. So the Stabilization and Recovery in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo project, our colleague Dan Owen, who leads that, It's a $250 million project focused also on public services and other activities to mitigate conflict. They can more precisely target what activities they finance, at what scale, and what locations and when, right? Over the lifetime of the project. But as they mentioned at the end of that video, we can adapt to these models. Once we've got all these dimensions of reality and perception of it going into a model, we can then start forecasting change in other phenomena, like levels of poverty, right? Like first order priorities for development organizations like the bank and also our humanitarian colleagues. Also macro physical pressure, we can expand it, to look at other territories, right? Collect similar data for other territories. We're just in Addis late last week with the government setting up a similar program and process with our colleague Matt Stevens that leads social development for the World Bank across East Africa. But even just collecting some of this data, right? So these are just some of the dimensions of what we call the natural world, that are ingested into the model, beyond what you'd think is orthodox temperature, precipitation. It's also what we can capture from satellite imagery. And that enables us also to produce data that has the necessary dimension, like frequency of production and historical depth where we don't have it, right? In the Horn of Africa, the Horn of Africa Drive project, this $330 million project that the bank had to focus on agro-pastoralists that are obviously in one of the most climate-affected territories in the world. They're going further and further in search of grazable land, right? But the bank doesn't really even know how many people are where, right? And so they might use a census, they might have like one household survey that they employ. But what we're able to do is we captured satellite imagery of 56 towns and cities demarcated in red there in that photo in the middle, and we captured satellite imagery for every month for 5 years, and then we trained an object classification model on that imagery. Once we got it to above 99.9% accuracy compared to Google Earth, right, classifying the number and density of built structures in the image, right, then we're at a point where we can confidently say, in this neighborhood, for example, and just one of these months over the 5 years in Wajir, Kenya, here in blue is the number of existing structures, and at the end of that 5-year period, here is the additional in yellow built structures in that location. But you can see how that's changing month to month. Just seeing that's a very big step forward for the bank. But when we're able to develop a model that also predicts with this level of performance, then that gives our development and humanitarian partners a level of confidence, most importantly in this, right? In what factors are most associated with change, whether it's conflict, whether it's climate dimensions, whether it's dimensions of the local and regional or global economy, or if it's like dimensions of perception of those things. And that helps them, again, better target what, where, when, at what scale they focus resources upon. The same thing goes for event data. We're all like always struggling and frustrated with, okay, we've got ArcLED, it's just measuring, number of armed conflict events, but we all know there's all these other dimensions of fragility that are occurring, right? And we can go to our colleagues in government and say, oh, do you have crime data you can share with us? Great, yeah, here you go, of course we do. And it's like annualized data. That doesn't have the frequency that we need for to ingest into a model. So instead, we're able to train interacting agentic LLMs that read newspapers, identify which articles talk about crime, in those newspaper articles, how many crime incidents are reported, and then with those crime incidents, what are the dimensions of those crime incidents, compare them to the reporting in other articles over 10 years, and identify if that's already duplicated. But again, just collecting this imagery allows us to, without even like processing it, allows us to see changing phenomena, right? In a territory like the Horn of Africa, where the anthropologists, the sociologists tell us, oh, like land is communal. People can come and graze their herds there. Well, the level of pressure is getting to a point clearly in some of these places, where people are fortifying territory to protect grazable land from communal use, and so then we can start to think of, okay, what are these other factors that we could also be predicting, right? And so now we're starting to work with some of our humanitarian and development partners to identify like which data is available, or could we produce that would allow us to predict change in poverty, predict change in employment or market conditions, predict levels of macro fiscal stress, right? And these are like huge development imperatives, as you will know better than me. And and of course, like in particular for our humanitarian colleagues, some of these opportunities, and especially to predict and also explain the drivers of change in food insecurity, is of imperative importance when we look at the changing levels of food insecurity over the last decade or so. So now, well, I think I'll skip the rest and jump straight to a demo here. We have, I'll just sort of talk you through, like, I mean, there's always this so what, oh, that's cool. You're predicting change in these phenomena. That must be an interesting research project, to be part of. And I'd love to sort of delve into what drives what, like I did my PhD or, my master's or my undergrad in X, Y, or Z. But for our colleagues, that actually have to make decisions, right? We have to be able to present this in a way that's digestible for them and actionable for them, right? And so what we're able to do is say, I've clicked on Lamu district, right? This is in what they call the West Nile region of Uganda. And clicking on Lamu, it will tell me, okay, here's the number of the changing number of the population in total. So that's host and refugee population in Lamu. And here's what we predicted. And then it will stop here because we've got it on a 3-month look ahead period. We can change it to 6 months. And what you'll see is this green line, and then the shaded space either side of it. That tells us, okay, like here's what we're predicting, but we really know that that the volume is going to be somewhere within this space. That tells you how well the model is performing or not, right? Across a specific look ahead period at a specific time. But most importantly, it tells them here's the changing level of pressure in that district, not just now, but like over the coming 1, 3, 6 months, specific to health, specific to education, specific to water. And then they come down and see, okay, like if we wait until that occurs, here's what we could do, right? If we begin to act now, if we have enough confidence in, in this level of predictive performance, as has been demonstrated, say, over the last 6 months, last year, here's what we could do. And then for our colleagues in Eastern DRC, or sorry, this will be South Sudan, right? It tells you up the top the percentage of refugees in that district that are from South Sudan or DRC. Here are the factors in South Sudan that are most associated with change. You've got humanitarian access index. You've got language about peace processes. Yeah, of course, you've got levels of conflict, cereal prices. If it's green, it's associated with lower levels of refugee flows. If it's the other, if it's red, it's associated with increase. And then we're starting to challenge our development and humanitarian colleagues to say, what if I just clicked on this drop-down menu and selected the self-reliance index, right? So if we adapted these models, right, and actually collected the data representing change in reality and perception of it in the host districts in Uganda, right, we could also then predict change in dimensions of the labor market, change in basic needs coverage, right? And you can come and click on any of these and see, okay, well, how is that measured? And probably people are probably thinking, oh, there's not data measuring that, but it's like, yes, it's imperfect data, but here's how we could measure it. And then we'd have to accept, some imperfection in that metric. And that also informs the judgment, right? Like this isn't AI like displacing human decision-making, right? This is making sure that our colleagues have as much information as possible so they can act on it or not if they're not confident enough in the metric or the metric combined with the level of predictive performance. Same for food insecurity here. And then they could see in a given district, these are the factors associated with increase and decrease in self-reliance and refugee self-reliance, which is where, of course, the focus is in this sector. So I've probably gone a little bit longer than we had, but selfishly, what I'd love to get from you is a critique of of this. I should have also said that we put in here along the timeline. These are a number of different World Bank projects, so we can see like at what point they started and how and whether there was any association. But what we'd like to do is gather the data that represents the nature and scale and location of the activities financed by those World Bank projects, so that we can actually ingest that into the model too and see, are these projects having like an impact? You know, I'm sure like our colleagues here in development and humanitarians, we all have our very legitimate grievances, right, with humanitarian and development monitoring and evaluation processes and their efficacy, right? And this doesn't need to replace that, you know, but it can be like a significant tool potentially, you know, for complementing and enhancing and introducing a little bit more rigor to those processes. So we decide from a project level, are we supporting the right activities? From a portfolio-wide activity level, are we focused? I'll take any questions and very much welcome any critique. We're always trying to get better, just like that social science informed process.
Thanks, Chris. That was really helpful. I don't have critique, but actually I have a couple of questions. First is to understand, how do countries go about taking this decision of starting to, you know, adopt a framework or an approach like this? So from your experience, what really, because everybody understands the stress service delivery is under, but what tips them over to take an approach like this? And second is, this seems like one use case, but I think the underlying capability is something that can actually help any government, city, subnational or national, plan service delivery better. Have you started applying it to certain use cases like that?
Do our hosts have a preference as to taking number of questions? Or, I mean, I'll quickly answer that one. The first thing is, you know, you need to, these capabilities to some extent novel, right? To some of our government colleagues, right? So you have to take them on a journey, right? And that's half the work. It's not just like developing the capacity, it's also breaking it down, you know, and you should be able to explain it in a digestible way, right? If you want someone to use it. Right? And that means every different component of it, and that takes time, and that takes iteration and piloting, right? So it's, you know, we started that pilot of the displacement crisis response mechanism back in 2018, right? And so we imagined together, they had an experience with risk finance in terms of drought, and actually the government came to us and said, you know, we can do this for drought. We have this never-ending displacement crisis, right? That goes up and down, and we're predicting drought. Can we at least measure this and respond more proportionately? So, you know, it was through that process then, you know, and that went well, right? They're really happy with how that occurred and how that was implemented. And then so they said, well, can we take another step and predict, right? And they saw, you know, that Horn of Africa model, we'd already developed that. So they said, okay, you know, you did that, go through peer review, external, internal, yes, okay. So let's try it here. And then if it works well here too, then we can connect it to the financing mechanism. So it's a journey, right? And so our colleagues from the Prime Minister's office, from the different ministries, Ministry of Finance, of course, critically, you know, they also presented what they had basically done, right? Like we're just providing the tools. They have to make the call. You know, are we going to engage with this? And our colleagues in the World Bank, if they're there online, Serena Kavici, Matt Stevens, who leads this work, Vara Vimeru, who's actually pioneered this displacement response mechanism with us way back in 2018 and is now practice manager across Africa for social protection and social development. You know, they had to also understand and believe in it, right? So it's about bringing people together that are not just willing to explore, you know, but are willing to vet and test, you know, and then understand how it can inform operations. That can be a long path, but now we're at a point where, you know, Dr. Limlim, who leads this in the Prime Minister's office, is going to Ethiopia and showing them. They're saying, yes, you know, we need that too, right? And to other countries in Africa. But for the other use cases, you know, you might be thinking about crime or prediction of population change generally, yes, you know. My background was working in the international system, you know, so that's naturally where I reached out to as we started to, I tried to get them to do this, didn't want to, so I left to, you know, and started now back working with them to try to introduce these type of capabilities. The second question, sorry, was? Right. Exactly. You could be thinking about these phenomena in, you know, in advanced economies, in particularly metropolitan settings. Sorry. Right. Yep. Mm. Right. Right. Yeah, I mean, you could make the same argument about, some of these countries we're actually already implementing, right? We also designed a program, for Ukraine, right? Which was measuring population change and then predicting population change between oblasts, right? But going beyond just identifying which factors are most associated with that, also looking at changing labor demand across oblasts, so that might be a really great metric for Moldova. I know it's like small, has like particular acute, sort of like not quite landlocked, but in effect challenges. But then we're able to identify at what time, what activities should the private sector be investing in, right, to optimize return on investment in which oblasts at what scale, right? So our private sector colleagues can then come in and have the information that suggests, okay, at an extreme end of the spectrum, we shouldn't be like, building a new museum in an oblast that's like right on the front line, right? Obviously, but there's a scale across which there's uncertainty, and there's enormous loss, and there's and there's significant risk. So it's like, how do we lower that risk so that investors are more confident and those communities are more confident in the investment that's coming in as well. So there's like actually more appetite and less cynicism.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation. Very interesting. I have two questions. So it was a lot of information, so maybe I missed it, but you mentioned that the accuracy, it's around 85%, I think. Is it more underestimating the number of people crossing the frontier or overestimating? So what are the main risks in terms of estimation? So my first question, and then it relates to the other use cases. It's mostly around population displacement, but have you thought, and are you training also this model for anticipating nutrition cases, for example, nutrition purposes, and which could be really interesting if we want to anticipate the need in IUTF, for example, or treatment, and then provide the supply chain in time, etc. So yeah, those are my two questions. Thank you very much.
Right. I mean, firstly, in terms of like predictive performance, right? The accuracy with which we're predicting different phenomena varies from one place to the other, and also varies across different look-ahead periods, right? So if we're predicting 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, that's why we'll always have a visualization of how the model is performing across those different look-ahead periods. For Uganda, for refugees coming from South Sudan and DRC, for example, right? The best look-ahead period, the graphs we showed you for DRC was 120 days. The graph for South Sudan was 180. We showed that because the models performed best for those specific countries and refugees coming from them over that look-ahead period, right? And then you also asked about, is it over or underestimating, right? Again, like we're tailoring these models to the thing we're trying to predict and the place we're trying to predict it. So I can't necessarily tell you this would happen predicting all social phenomena, across the world in all places. But what our experience is that when there's significant volatility, right, when you have a really significant spike, those phenomena, those patterns are a bit more difficult to predict, in terms of like the accuracy. But what we commonly see is that there is an underestimation, right, when it comes to spikes. So say like spikes of refugee flows or spikes of armed conflict. And the food use case, yeah. I mean, again, right, you might have like food insecurity, or you might, since you're familiar with like the FICE measurement, for example, like moderate, intermediate, severe levels of food insecurity, and there are great processes for going about making those determinations, but they don't necessarily produce data with the frequency, right, and historical depth that we would need. So we could accompany those and triangulate with like language about behaviors, right, that are associated with moderate, intermediate, and severe levels of food insecurity. That might not be a perfect measure, but at least like it's a measure that's frequent enough, and we could produce enough historical depth that we could then see, okay, like is it doesn't necessarily have to exactly match, but is it changing at the same level as, say, one FAO or WFP measurement at this point in time to this point in time? And so if the change is proportionate, then that data of high velocity can also be used, and we can predict change in it whilst accounting for what that would mean in terms of like an FAO or WFP determination. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Mohammed Vervani. I'm from the Norwegian Refugee Council. I have a question. Okay, I've just attended a session where they talked about the political sensitivity of data.
Right.
And in this case, I think you must have faced such political sensitivity because this data is really, really sensitive. So how did you overcome such a challenge?
Right. I mean, we aggregate, right, the topics, right? We won't say a language about people from this ethnicity, right? Or language about, people of this gender, right? So, and then we'll say language about politicians, like about politicians, language about government, right? So, so from that perspective, we seek to desensitize whilst also, providing data that can, to some extent, inform operations as well, right? But then often, we might hold this kind of content back. And what we'll do is we'll identify language. We can even identify phraseology associated with decline, right? And levels of armed conflict. But then even if we could, we wouldn't, we wouldn't share that language associated with increase, right? Because there are perverse incentives sometimes for different actors in conflict, and they, we don't want to empower people to exaggerate problems. We want to reduce social risk. So that's the method, and we have engaged with a number of experts on this to help us think through, right? Because these are emerging capabilities, and there's no guidelines, let alone regulations or laws that basically say what you can and can't do. Right, so it's a burden on us, but one like we understand is absolutely critical. So engaged with Prince Zayed of Jordan, who was formerly UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Comfort Ero, who now leads the International Crisis Group, and a gentleman, Lord Butler, who responded to the frustrations in the UK about the absence of regulations of ministers, and developed what they call a cabinet manual, right? So had to think through all perverse incentives, what constitutes corruption, and then how do we therefore regulate it? And so to have those, those experiences assist us was really helpful in developing what constitutes risk. Can we manage and mitigate it? If what can't we manage and mitigate away, what we call residual risk, and then how do we weigh that residual risk against the risk of not engaging, right? So that's kind of like a very crude synopsis of the process. I think maybe we have one last question. So apologies. I'm getting the word from our organizers. And just before we take that question, if I could be so bold, I just want to thank Catholic Relief Services, the ICT4D conference, Tech Change, for organizing this and giving us the opportunity. Unfortunately, our bank colleagues, due to the exigent circumstances in the region, we just came from Uganda, for example, were not able to join us on stage and had to travel elsewhere. But just to thank you for this opportunity to get this great feedback, critique, insights, questions, from our community of practice. Sorry for that interruption.
No worries. No, thank you so much for sharing. This is a really great illustration of how you were already very well placed in a real humanitarian or development problem, and had access to those resources and those connections that allowed you to then build those models over long term, and then tap into the new capabilities that deep learning and NLP represent today to move beyond what predictive modeling we could be doing in 2018. So this is really great. And also you mentioned a lot of data sets that you had access to help you build these models. So I wanted to ask, are you open to sharing the model or sharing the learning from this modeling work so that we could maybe also perhaps use it in our work?
Short answer is yes. Opportunities like this are opportunities to share. We've published, various materials, about a whole range of different models. If you search refugee prediction World Bank, you'd come across a blog about that. You'd come across they have a whole website with all sorts of different levels of detailed or more palatable material, like going from that video all the way through to papers for models predicting crime, models predicting conflict, models predicting population change. A couple of those I also demonstrated. There's a paper that the World Bank just published during what they call the spring meetings in DC last month that I was able to participate in and author with Vara Vamira, who's going to be on the stage with us today, and Dan, who also had to travel, Dan Owen. And that goes into some of the detail of, okay, like what did we do? Like what are the challenges in terms of architecture, data access? What can't you get, right? Like you can't get data, measuring volume of arms going into, DRC. And so you have to accept there are different phenomena. You can get language about, availability of arms. That's going to be a very different metric to actual levels. Some of these things, are by their nature opaque, and therefore you can't quantify, but very open to sharing. And we've just been on a tour, through Addis and Kampala, not just to work with governments to get this on the road, but, with our Norwegian Refugee Council, of course, with UNHCR, who we have to collaborate with very closely, with IOM, with a whole range of government, humanitarian development, and of course, most importantly, community and beneficiary stakeholders, come into the room and give us the feedback. Well, that doesn't make sense because of X, Y, Z, right? And so, yeah, for us, it's just as beneficial to share and get feedback as hopefully it might be beneficial for yourselves to use. And then finally, I should also mention and thank, the Kingdom of the Netherlands for their support through the Forced Displacement Trust Fund, the Prospects Fund, which they also support, the UNHCR World Bank Joint Data Center, which is also funding dimensions of this work, the Republic of Korea, South Korea Trust Fund, which has been funding this work, amongst others, at least those models that we've done with